Hi, Tripp.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty spectacular. I'm getting to talk to someone that has whispered in my ear during many hours of dishwashing.
You know, it's weird. I must have repressed that part of my life. I don't recall accompanying you during. I'm hoping that means you're a longtime blogging head / meaningoflife.tv.
Oh yeah, long
Listener.
time listener, sometimes viewer. First
Yeah.
time interact. No, second time. I had you on my podcast in 2010.
True. And we're going to talk about your podcast. And let me just say, in response to all that, God bless you, as they say in your line of work. Your line of work being, masterful transition on my part, your line of work being, well, first of all, podcasting, but also kind of theology. You do a theology podcast called Homebrewed Christianity. Has a very big following. You've been doing it a long time. I want to talk about that, what your mission is, and all kinds of related things. I mean, to me, let me describe the podcast, and then you tell me what I got wrong. For starters, I'd say it does seem aimed at people who are interested in the possibility that you can be religious and even specifically Christian while still being like a well-educated person with an interest in ideas and a modern sensibility. That's fair to say is part of its mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's partly a way of saying it does deal in actual theology. I mean, if you just told me, like, imagine a Christian podcast, I would imagine, the kind of thing I see when I turn my TV on and, and see a church service being televised. And this is not that. It's more, it's theology, but at the same time, it's, I guess you would say user-friendly theology in that it's not only for theologians, I assume. It's for people who are believers flirting with belief or whatever, and want to think about the relevant concepts, including God, in a what I guess you could call, I hope without insulting anybody who else, a sophisticated way. So why don't you? I'll stop and let you correct me or supplement. I mean, it's also interesting. One thing that's interesting is, as our viewers know and our listeners don't, I'm like turning like a kind of, you are like illuminate. Just the contact with you alone seems to be illuminating me in some profound sense that has the effect of making me look like an extraterrestrial. But I'll work on the lighting, and I'll work on the lighting while you tell me what's right or wrong with what I just said.
Well, I mean, I guess the podcast itself uses the metaphor of homebrewing because it started when I was in divinity school at Wake Forest University. And we wanted money from the school to have a beer drinking theology club, because we paid student fees and we didn't get access to the money without a club. So we made one.
So there wasn't already a line item in the university's budget for beer drinking theology?
No.
Get-togethers? That's so weird.
Yeah, no, historically Baptist school, it did not exist. And so that kind of started it, and that was kind of at the beginning of the craft beer craze, and homebrewing got popular again. And so the idea was that most Christians in the United States think Christianity is the equivalent of Pabst Blue Ribbon. It technically won a blue ribbon hundreds of years ago, but if you drink it today, it tastes like chilled piss. And the only time it fills you with the Spirit is if you're suspended upside down for extended periods of time and form in front of like a ancient institution, probably with Greek letters on the front, like a fraternity. So like that Christianity, as most people know it, is kind of flat, tasteless, and boring. But in the academy and in the history of the church, history of philosophy, there are lots of resources, voices, ideas that don't get any play, don't get heard, and most Christians would be unfamiliar with them. And my experience as a campus minister when I was in divinity school was that a lot of Christians had really good questions that they should ask and doubts that they should get the voice. and pushbacks to the injustice the church has been propagating or, playing the chaplain to and stuff like that. And that there's actual resources to think about living, life-giving, liberating faith where you don't set your brain aside. So the idea is to interview different scholars each week, and they are, quote, ingredients to brew your own faith. So as opposed to like the one new, better version of Christianity, it's a collection of resources to have a diversity of palettes and such.
It's like open source kind of. No, that's the wrong metaphor, because it isn't everyone collectively working to build the same product. It's DIY, do it yourself, whatever, DIY. And you provide the resources, and you talk to these very highbrow theologians. You talk to a lot of the leading contemporary theologians.
Surprisingly, because no one does it very often, if they find out more than 100 people will hear what they say. But if you're 70,000 people listen to this, they're like, what? And they want to. That's the funniest part to me, is that you could literally be a professional scholar, and like 100 people listens to what you say, and you're pretty jazzed. And the church, think of all the Christians that 70,000 people listen to. They're almost all ridiculous. There's probably multiple Christianities, and the one most people are familiar with, I don't belong in, but that's never really kept me from locating myself there in some type of way.
Okay, well, one question I have that I don't expect an immediate answer to, but I'd like to work our way around to an answer, is kind of given the fact that this is the modern world, it's a scientific age, partly in response to science, I think, theologies have developed that, as you've suggested, are very different from your grandmother's theology, so to speak. And one question I have is what range of things can people believe? Like, in your mind, what is the range of things people can believe, conceptions of the divine they can have, and so on, and still be called a Christian? Okay? So at one end, let me revisit my youth. I grew up Southern Baptist. Now, did you grow up Southern Baptist or what?
Yeah. My family were church planters, so we were Southern Baptist, but...
No, wait, what does that term mean? They were church planters?
Yeah, like you start new churches.
That was their line of work?
Mm-hmm.
And then they would hand them off to a minister?
Church planters, well, you are the minister, and then depending on... usually a church planter will be there the first 5 years, sometimes 10, and then they move on. It's a church entrepreneur of sorts.
Like it's a serial religious entrepreneur.
Yeah. So, but it also means if you're a preacher's kid, you only go to the church your parents go to. So like questions around science and stuff. When I was in 5th grade, it was Holy Week, and Holy Week, right before Easter. And I read all 4 Gospels accounts of the crucifixion and resurrection. And I charted them out because Baptists like to make charts with Bible verses. Mm-hmm. Normally it's about foreign policy in Daniel 17, but sometimes it's about the end of Jesus' life. And I called my parents in and said, my Bible's broken. Different people see Jesus first. He gets crucified on a different day in John than the other 3. Mm-hmm. He says different stuff on the cross. One time he's like, why have you forsaken me, Dad? And the other time he's like, into your hands I commend my spirit. And I'm like, what the hell? And my dad's like, nope, that's how it is. Your Bible's not broken. And so from that point on, I had always had intellectual curiosity, and criticism actually became part of my own piety. So, he let me read an introduction to the New Testament book from his library. And by the time I got out of high school, I was reading like Paul Tillich, Kierkegaard, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that kind of stuff. And, trying to read science and religion things, but I still am not sure what that means. Even though I've faked it in PhD seminars. But I never learned enough math.
Yeah, and you kind of, that issue, I think, informs a lot of what you do, the science and religion thing. And occasionally, I saw you had a conversation with, is it Ted Stevens?
Ted Peters.
Ted Peters, sorry. Who is a theologian who kind of deals in these things. You had a fairly recent podcast with him. So, okay, so let me ask. So I'm assuming that you did not, it sounds like you didn't have happen to you what I had happened to me, which was, I'm talking Southern Baptist. First of all, this is earlier than your era. So it's like, my parents grew up during the Depression, West Texas, farm families. I went to a Baptist church in Midland, Texas for a while to give you a sense of the flavor. Mm-hmm. So, they were creationists basically. So when I became very enamored of the theory of natural selection, I started asking about what about these dinosaur fossils, at age maybe 12 or 13, but as a sophomore in high school, the theory of natural selection was so compelling that I really started developing issues with my religious heritage. And my parents actually brought a Baptist minister who was a friend of theirs. At this point, we were living in San Antonio. My father was in the Army, so we moved around. But brought a Baptist minister in to try to convince me that, evolution hadn't happened. Mm-hmm. And he was actually pretty well versed in the standard, old school Christian rebuttals to evolution, and was a nice guy. And he didn't succeed, but he was a nice guy. So it sounds like from the get-go, am I right? Your parents, you didn't have issues at that level, right? Your parents were not creationists.
No. No. And my dad was a Teilhard fan.
Okay, so let's say for those of us not steeped, Teilhard de Chardin, Catholic mystic who, is almost
evolutionary anthropologist.
Yeah, and also kind of envisioned the information age. Was saying nearly 100 years ago was saying technology is building a giant global brain that for planet Earth. And the question is, can we find a giant heart, to accompany that? Mm-hmm. Right now, the answer would seem to be not yet, but anyway.
Yeah. But just for me, what I was given then was a collection of his prayers that were all prayers of gratitude for life, creation, that were framed by someone who's a paleontologist. So the story of our cosmic history into the story of biological evolution was a way of coming to have greater gratitude for the ongoing process of creation and the gift and movement of life. And so I realized my parents put me in a weird position. So when I went to college and I went to a Baptist school for undergrad, I kind of freaked out to find out a lot of them didn't even think women could be ministers, let alone like my LGBTQ friends, or that they were really gung-ho about the war in Iraq when it started when I was in undergrad. And I'm like, pray for your enemies. Mm-hmm. And they're like, no. When he said, blessed are the peacemakers, he was talking about our missiles that we use in Iraq.
Well, they are called peacemakers, aren't they?
I know.
People didn't actually say that to you, did they?
No, I said it back to them in a snarky way. I went to Campbell University, and it's got the most active military as students because it's right next to Fort Bragg and Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. And I was a sophomore during on 9/11, and we had later, right before we were about to blow junk up in Afghanistan, a prayer rally for peace right before we blow things up. And I was the worship leader for one of the campus ministry groups. So the president of the university asked me to play a song. And so I wrote a song called The Peace of War.
I thought you were going to say you played Imagine by John Lennon or something, but
no, it was even worse. It was one of the verses, like, sitting on a mount, he gave his words unto the people, blessed are the peacemakers. Hey, that's a great name for a missile. And but the chorus was like, isn't it crazy? Isn't it so to know I sleep a bit better in the peace of war? And so for me, like, the breakup with Christianity was 9/11, that somehow you have these narratives of a first century homeless revolutionary rabbi, and we go, that story, that person is the image of God, and yet we are rallying behind a flag and our faith at the same time to go kill people under a narrative of religious violence and conflict. Like I have this weird thing where if the new atheists are right, that's what religion really is, then we should be atheists. I just don't think they're right. But like, I understand that response, right? Where like, if this is what religion is, the means to tell beautiful stories until we have to rally our tribe to do unspeakable things, then it should, go the way of the dodo.
So let's talk a little about the new atheists as a way of like continuing to wind our way around to this question of like the, kind of the almost the scope of modern theology, as you see it, modern Christian theology. What do you think the new atheists are getting wrong? They must be getting something wrong from your point of view. Well, if you had to list things they're getting wrong, where do you start?
Well, so some like Michael Roos, I just recorded a podcast with him, atheist philosopher, but I think he's correct in that they just aren't that wonderful at philosophy all the time. So in one sense, like every time I get in an argument with a recent convert to the new atheism, like the new atheists, I think, function as a religion, and that actually is bad in the religious communities. Like people like myself, a lot of people like you're friends with at Union Theological Seminary are trying to advocate for science, and because they essentialize religion to be the worst expression of it, then all these people of faith where I'm going in introducing science and how we should be celebrating children that desire to go in scientific fields and not see it as a threat. They're like, no, it should be, because Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. And so, like, in one sense, right. I think if we want to not kill ourselves on the planet by warring religions using nukes or the ecological collapse, we should probably, in the next 50 years, not make toxic relationships of religious people so that they dismiss science.
Yeah,
like,
no,
pragmatically.
I mean, I honestly think, lately in certain majority Muslim countries, there's been a little bit of a backlash against evolutionary biology, which historically there had not been. Islam had not paid a whole lot of attention to that issue one way or the other. And I genuinely think, and I have some support for this among people who are in a position to know, that Richard Dawkins has contributed to this. Richard Dawkins has told Muslims, Darwin is the enemy of Islam. And you get, and I think that's a little related to the kind of thing you were saying. But in any event, I mean, I've told Sam Harris, like, this is just not productive. It's like grabbing, if you think grabbing people by the shoulders and saying, you don't understand, your God doesn't exist, is going to make them less fundamentalist, you do not understand the way the dynamic works.
Yeah, and I would say, like, the other thing that comes up around the new atheists for me is that while a lot of the positions they hold are among the viable options in the different disciplines, say like Dan Dennett's theory of consciousness is one among the viable ones currently, but it's not the only one. But then he acts as if it is, and so if you have any other theory of mind, he equates it to like sneaking in the Trinity, so he's like allergic to other theories of mind. And so to me, one of the part of the kind of reductive materialist agenda, or the side effects, is that it not only makes sure the world's so flat God can't fit in it, but it reduces human dignity, and you're problematized to talk about all the things that make humans most human in our own existential experience. It flattens away holding eye contact while making love as something other than fan fiction of our genes, holding a baby for the first time and telling it a name that's completely arbitrary, apparently, except for reproducing your DNA. It doesn't sit and go, holy shit, we're at 13.8 billion years and now we're enjoying a symphony. Or to be repulsed when you look at genocide and those type of things, like meaning, purpose, value, goals. All that stuff gets shrunk out, and I worry that our dignity as a species is getting reduced in hopes of flattening out reality so that God can't come back in.
Yeah.
And where that ends up, I think, playing out is a lot of contemporary theologies are naturalist in form, that they don't have God as a supernatural out there that intervenes randomly type of deity. But their naturalism is one with essentially causal closure, and from the Big Bang on and a few constants, you give them that and everything's already determined and set. And I think the resistance to thinking about openness, top-down causality, a wider theory of mind, is they're worried that God's going to come in by the back end.
Yeah, let me jump in there. I mean, first I'm going to do a little bit of an aside. You did a podcast with Rupert Sheldrake. And let me first of all do the disclaimer thing. I mean, I haven't looked into his work in a long time. Last time I looked at it was like mid-'80s. I was working at the Sciences magazine, and his theory of morphic resonance didn't seem compelling to me. It was pretty widely considered, certainly within the scientific community, as wooish. Mm-hmm. So I'm not embracing all his work, but he did say something he emphasized something in the podcast that I think is exactly right, which is just that the fundamental problem, he might not say it exactly like this, but a fundamental, if not the fundamental problem for anyone who thinks we've got everything figured out in a way that eliminates possibilities like higher purpose and various other things. The problem is consciousness. The problem is that it is like something to be alive. The problem is subjective experience, because I've done this elsewhere. I don't want to get into it at great length. In fact, I would steer people toward a conversation I had with the philosopher Gideon Rosen on Meaning of Life TV about this. You want to hear me talking to a straight up, hardcore, first-rate philosopher about why it's a problematic thing. I don't want to say problematic for a scientific worldview, because I'm like a pretty hardcore Darwinian and selfish genist is the funny thing, but it's just something that tells us there's something we just do not understand yet. And I want to say that, but then, as an aside, but then I want to get back to this issue of causal closure. And this is a question this brings us back to the range of kind of Christian theology. So I assume that to be Christian, I mean, one could on the one hand have a kind of a deistic conception of higher purpose that I think you can sketch out a reasonably attractive version of that's 100% straightforwardly compatible with science, where the purpose of that evolution itself has a purpose as it unfolds through material means. It's like maybe building a giant global brain is a purpose. Who knows? But you can have a scenario where there's some kind of purpose that's totally compatible with science, but, even with causal closure, I think you could say. But
yeah.
And by causal closure, we mean, is there any input from beyond the material, beyond the realm of scientific laws acting on material stuff? Is there anything beyond that influences the world? And what I want to ask you is, do you have to be a Christian? Do you have to believe the answer is yes? Because I mean, I could elaborate on why I'm asking that, but first let me ask you that. Do you have to believe the universe is not causally closed?
I don't think you do, just because if you hang out with enough theologians in the academy, you'll find out plenty of them are perfectly well committed Christians. And the horizon, the theological horizon, to think what disciplines are part of existence that theology talks about, a lot of them will narrow it, essentially taking Kant, where here are the things we can talk about, and here are the things we think practically about, ethics and stuff like that. And so if you follow Kant, about 2/3 of liberal theologians do, then the natural sciences and such are kind of tangential to the work of theology. Theology is primarily about ethics, the formation of ethics, the formation of communities that inspire good living and things like that. Then you could think of postmodern, different types of kind of post-structuralist inspired theologies where they share a certain critique against kind of scientific naturalism that I don't know how you actually end up deciding how they think about it. I've interviewed a bunch of them and think that
we both interviewed John Caputo.
Yeah, and John's been on my podcast a bunch. He and I are very good friends. He's currently, spending a lot of time with Ilya Dilio, who is a very committed evolutionary naturalist who doesn't believe in causal closure. And she was a biologist and a sister before being a theologian. And I've been present listening to them talk, and there seems to be that friendship, I think, could bring some insights as to what the boundaries are. But like for me, I would rather I probably wouldn't be a Christian if I thought God didn't do anything. It seems to be like a minimal viable definition of God is that God does something. Mm-hmm. Now, also supernaturalism or divine intervention or like omnipotence is just not viable for me, because as a Christian, God should at least be as nice as Jesus. And if God's omnipotent, then God really sucks at being loving. Like I wouldn't even let that God babysit. Like Bob, like
you wouldn't let an omnipotent being babysit. What's the? I wouldn't mind an omnipotent but super nice person babysitting for me. Well, what's your issue?
The God let a lot of kids walk in front of moving cars.
I see. You're saying if God is babysitting and is omnipotent, then he's not a nice guy, because look what happens to some kids.
Yeah. And and there's a lot of examples of it, but and I think if you just look at most theology in every religious tradition comes out where the scale of the universe that we think on is so small, and the universe has gotten so much bigger and longer that to the idea that God creates by fiat and not in some type of co-creative cooperative process just seems odd. Otherwise, like there's like 13.8 billion years of whatnot, as opposed to a beautiful story of growing complexity, depth, and interaction. So the question of closure is one, and here's the spectrum of things I guess that come up. There are some theological schools that are panpsychists. There are some
that, by panpsychists we mean that consciousness or subjective experience, sentience, is embedded in the very fabric of matter, and some degree of it exists in a speck of dust, not much, but a little, and then it builds up as you get complex physical things.
Yeah, and most panpsychists would emphasize. In philosophy, it's called dual aspect monism, so that there is just one thing, mass energy, but the events of mass energy have an inside and an outside, just like as a radical empiricist, you and I do, right? Like the problem of consciousness is that you can brain scan us, but to know what the brain scan is saying, you're going to ask us something, and then we're going to tell you what it's like to be ourselves for you to create a key to interpret it. And the only way you'd ever even prove that it was right would be that we're telling you the truth, which requires access to a consciousness you don't have access to. Right. So a dual aspect monism, it comes out of what is generally called radical empiricism, where it's not just empiricism that's science based on, it's radical in that the activity of doing science or the activity of thinking reveals consciousness. And that can't be a fact that then gets deflated or dismissed. There are different types of idealists in philosophy.
Maybe say idealists. Well, one version of idealism suggests that the world out there doesn't necessarily exist as you perceive it. I mean, an interesting thing about empiricism, about insisting that you really all you have is the evidence of your senses, right? On the one hand, that sounds like hardcore scientific perspective, because that's what scientists say. All we have is the evidence, the things we see. Do not give me any bullshit intuition about higher anything. All we have is the evidence. But empiricism, carried to its logical extent, leads to this kind of all-encompassing doubt about the actual reality of everything, quote, out there, because you don't actually have contact with it out there. All you have is the sensory information that enters your system, and for all you know, you're in the matrix. And so that's a little tangent that's partly devoted to explaining what we mean by idealism. It involves a kind of a doubt about materialism that ironically can grow out of empiricism, right?
Mm-hmm. And in idealism, which was popular basically in most philosophy departments until the 30s or 40s, is starting to have a resurgence, just like panpsychism is growing again. And I think a lot of it is philosophers having responses to the dead ends around these biggest questions that you get, that when scientists and philosophers are trying to answer the biggest questions humans ask on terms of a kind of reductive materialist account, you get stuck, or you get like Michael Shermer just going like, no, these four mysteries are official mysteries that are permanent mysteries. Therefore, my ideology that has nothing to contribute to them other than to insist all religious people are fundamentalists and they're wrong. Yeah. We're going to leave it there.
Although I will say Michael is more open-minded than some people who identify as new atheists. But I have to pause and let my dog in just so he'll quit scratching on my office door.
And there's no good blogging heads without a dog.
Without a dog. Okay, come on. Okay, so Milo and I have this little love session every morning after he. Come here, Milo. He's bizarrely standoffish sometimes, but I gotta say, this is not irrelevant. It's like after he has his breakfast, he comes up, and usually I'm like sitting in this chair over there, and he gets up in my lap, and Milo does this weird like intense eye contact thing, and I mean, maybe I don't know, maybe I can like show you a version of it now. Like, okay, well, we missed most of him, but anyway, and it's like. Sometimes looking into the eyes of my dog, I think there's something deep going on here. I'm sorry. It's like it gets back to the fact that we don't understand subjective experience. But when I don't want to get too far off on this, but it's funny. You almost can't do this thing with a human because, as some anthropologist once said, if humans make eye contact for more than 5 seconds, it means they're going to either fight or make love. Well, with a dog who likes eye contact, you can really gaze into their eyes for an extended period of time and ponder like what's like the magic of actually making contact with another sentient being. And like the fact that there's definitely something going on that is not describable in conventional material terms, even if it turns out that the conventional material explanation can, in some sense, explain it. Anyway, I just want to say Milo is an aid to reflection, to deep reflection, is my main thing.
Oh, I agree. Rupert Sheldrake has a whole book on his dogs.
Oh, really?
We did all these surveys on how dogs know their masters are coming home. So,
I heard you talk about that. Now that's the thing where like, I want to see the data. I mean, I guess it's out there. He's done it. He's got this theory where dogs have, he thinks there's something beyond regular sensory perception going on, and dogs are better than you would guess at knowing when their masters are they have a sixth sense for when their masters are going to return and come home. And he did these trials. And see, I would think that there's enough hostility toward that in the new atheist community that somebody would go over his data carefully. I don't have time. I would be inclined to go over it skeptically, but I hope, Sam, if you're out there, get one of your people on this, man. You've got the resources.
Yeah, we know that he could easily just, start another Kickstarter for it because.
He's better at fundraising than.
Well, no. See, they don't have a church to tithe to, Bob. So that's a good point. I still remember the little envelopes, the little offering envelopes in Sunday Southern Baptist Church. I'm trying to. The modern equivalent of that, I guess, is Patreon. But the other thing I would say is that to get out of causal closure, there are philosophers of science who argue for a type of emergence where, mind emerges and then it has top-down causality, and so it's not completely bottom-up. And in any of those, you can see evolutionary type of theology where God's interaction is at the level of mind in whatever level mind operates.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the closer to the further down the complexity spectrum that there's genuine mind openness, responsiveness, subjectivity, or whatever, then that's the place in which you have a kind of dynamic relationality.
Yeah. So let me ask you why I'm interested in the causal closure. Like I would think that if you're going to call yourself a Christian, you have to see Jesus as in some sense special. Now, when I was young as a Southern Baptist, the story was pretty straightforward. Son of God, sent to earth. The Son of God part was kind of a surprise. It wasn't clear, the whole kind of Messiah, Son of God sent to sacrifice so that you could be released from the burden of your sins. All you have to do is believe to get that release. And it's a story that was kind of meant to be not clear until Jesus was crucified and resurrected. And there was resurrection and in a literal, body coming to life. If you had been there, you'd see it, you'd have seen it, and so on. And then, the whole, kingdom of heaven gets a little complicated, depending on whether you mean by it what was probably meant at the time or what came to be meant. Leave that aside. Anyway, that type of story, and obviously that's not what everyone who calls himself a Christian, especially a Christian theologian, would say today. But I would think that they have to think that, well, maybe I'm wrong. That's the question. Do they have to think Jesus was special, and even in a way that involves something other than causal closure? What I mean by that is I can imagine a super intelligence that sets sets evolution in motion, and just engineering the algorithm of natural selection such that you get more complex life. Maybe you'd get intelligent life eventually, life that builds technologies that build a giant global brain. I can imagine that. But to imagine like a God that engineers natural selection such that 2,000 years ago there would be this particular thing happening, right? It's hard for me to imagine building that into the algorithm. I mean, much less the Big Bang, right? So it's hard for me to imagine that you take the divinity of Jesus very seriously in anything like a straightforward way without intervention or something, right? Mm-hmm. Without divine intervention. If this is making sense, I've probably said enough for you to talk, right?
Yeah. So I think for myself, a number of different contemporary theologians, if you aren't a supernaturalist where a God breaks in and intervenes, but God cooperates in the ongoing process of the cosmos, then and the question of subjectivity is an important one. So in whatever way you imagine subjectivity emerging at whatever point, then God would be operative at that level, right? So, and you can see it if you think of Jesus in his ministry, he calls God Abba, like a loving parent, and is responsive or faithful to the call of God. And that doesn't require breaking any laws or whatnot for him to be faithful.
So you mean it could be that Jesus was an unusually sensitive human?
Yeah. Well, and I would just put it this way for a process. I mean, I work with Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy. So in his philosophy, he worked with Bertrand Russell and then he came back to believing in God as a mathematician thinking about science right at the emergence of quantum situation, to really wrestle with the principle of limitation for possibility. Like, how is it that you have what amounts to a generative complexity moving situation? And so God comes back in primarily as the principle of limitation.
And this is called process theology, right?
Well, certain theologians that use his philosophy do. But, I mean, I think Teilhard does something real similar. There's plenty of others that, well, you've had John Hott on, John Tatamano's been
modern
on.
Theologians in that, somewhat in that tradition.
Yeah. So, if God and the world have always already been in relationship, and God desires to relate to the world and bring about a context of more complexity, depth, subjectivity. But the problem of evil is one where coercion or omnipotence is problematic. Then it's not available to a loving God to coerce any agency. God can invite it, lure it, call it, if you're speaking theologically. So for me, the question isn't, as a panentheist,
and we should say maybe, like, panentheist, I gather, is that the world exists within the mind of God in some sense. I mean, in pantheism, the world, in the sense of all of nature, all of the material universe, is God in pantheism, in some sense that I'm not sure I understand the appeal of as an idea. But anyway, the panentheism, it's more like the universe is within God's mind.
Yeah. And if you think of someone like Teilhard, that God, the world is not apart from God, the world is within God, but God is more than the world. So when you think of how Teilhard talks about the growth of mind throughout cosmic history, all the way to the new sphere and stuff, it's because the movement or trajectory of history, or in your own kind of questioning as a new agnostic, like where. Like how you can make a case for purpose. A theologian would just say the case for purpose is that there's a cooperative, non-coercive mind that it is inviting but not determining the unfolding. So, like, that humans evolved is not like like that's not like God knew it, but God cooperates with what's there each moment.
Right. And human agency has to be a thing here, right? Free will has to be a thing in this scenario.
Well, not like libertine free will, but I would think. Well, for me, I think if it's not, there's a lot of things that are odd.
We agree. Let's just isolate that as something we absolutely agree on. There are a lot of things that are odd.
Yeah, but if you're asking about Jesus in the evolutionary context, like, then. If each moment is the fruit of God and the world, co-creating a moment, then Jesus, it's by his full faithfulness to God that he becomes the embodiment of God. So he's the New Testament calls him the image of the invisible God. Why? Because God is primarily the principle of generative, creative, loving mind, but he embodies it. But he doesn't embody it outside of a context. Jesus makes no sense if you don't have the whole history of Israel, the prophets, his mom who sang socialist songs to him in the tummy, like the Magnificat. And like Jesus then is the fruit of a non-interventionist, loving, evolutionary presence of God. And so it's his full faithfulness, as opposed to kind of, at least when I grew up, people would say, oh, Jesus was sin-free. And then you thought maybe he didn't have wet dreams. But the positive way of saying is Jesus was fully faithful. And in being fully faithful, he actually materialized or enacted or embodied or enfleshed the Logos or the Sophia or
Logos.
God.
Yeah. Now that's a whole thing. There's so many things we could get into. I mean, I want to say quickly that the reason I ask about human agency is, like, if you imagine a deterministic universe, and you say, well, he invites but doesn't coerce. I'm like, wait a second. In a deterministic, universe, you got to choose. I mean, either something dictates that the thing happen or it doesn't, and the thing can't, like, decide. I guess that's what I'm saying is there has to be something. It seems to me there, if you're going to do this encourage but not compel thing with in talking about God's role in the world, it seems to me you're not talking at a minimum, you're not talking about a completely deterministic universe, right? I mean, maybe you're going to go compatibilist on me, and we should just.
I don't even know what that means. Like, your frustration with compatibilist is, I just want to retweet it every time. They can't answer really basic questions, and see, I find just like the question around there being some type of freedom, and then you dodging it with compatibilism or just denying it, is the same thing that frustrates me when you use a computer as the primary metaphor for human mind, or you get rid of consciousness altogether, and it's an epiphenomenon. And that's like, I could imagine myself not being a Christian and living a life, but the idea that I wouldn't want to intellectually argue for human dignity of having actual consciousness and some type of agency, and the experience of beauty being real, like things like that, I just find those problematic. In my experience, when I've interacted with, at least Dan Dennett and Sam Harris, when I've interacted with them, nothing about to me I feel like they perform a type of human depth and subjectivity that their accounts of the world don't necessarily make sense of. And I don't mean that in a critical way.
No, I would call it a charitable depiction of them.
But like when Dan Dennett came to Claremont, and he came, I emailed him, responded very graciously. Our philosophy of science class is like half theist, half atheist. We're reading his book. Philip Clayton, my professor, is a big philosopher of science. Will you come and do a dialogue with him? Oh, yeah. Do you think, and his response was, do you think you could have, if the school's going to have us stay over an extra day to do this, you could get someone to drive my wife and I to go wine tasting? And I'm like, but he's old. They've had the beautiful life together. He wants to savor each moment, bring her when he travels, go wine tasting. And in my mind, I'm like, yes, like that's a beautiful thing to do. And I couldn't figure out how that makes sense with his understanding of human experience and free will. And so it wasn't like I'm being mean to him. I just want to be like, I want to say, like, your life testifies to me to valuing a depth of subjectivity that your system can't acknowledge. Yeah. And sometimes we live into spaces that we can't yet understand.
Well, I would say if you're going to be mean to somebody on the basis of their view of consciousness, I would nominate Dan because, and this is just to get back to something else you said, I think you kind of conflated having an epiphenomenalist view of consciousness with believing it doesn't exist. I don't think that's like exactly right. I mean, an epiphenomenalist just sees consciousness as completely 100% determined by the material system. To the extent that I can understand what Dan is saying, he goes further and is basically an eliminativist. And now he gets mad when you say this, but I don't understand any other way to interpret what he's saying. I think he's saying consciousness does not exist. And a lot of people share that view of what the implication is of what he's saying. Maybe I'm wrong, but that to me is flat out, I don't want to use a word like crazy, but whatever is the nicer version of that. It's just I don't understand how people hold the view of consciousness he holds. I understand being an epiphenomenalist, fine, but I don't understand eliminativism.
But I mean, I say that, but like I just said, I think that there could be a principle of reason that's a part of evolutionary history. And if you want to know what it looks like, there was a fully faithful Jew to the lure of God in the first century Palestine. Like, that's pretty crazy as well. So I don't want to, having crazy ideas.
You don't want to be down on crazy.
Yeah. And I don't think it took science to think identifying an executed revolutionary as the image of God for it to get crazy. I think it's a
crazy world.
Yeah.
So let's see, where do we, okay, so I guess, is there anything else you want to say about causal? I guess the short answer, well, okay, maybe I should demand that you give us the one word answer to be a Christian, do you have to believe that the universe is not causally closed? Is the answer yes or no?
Just because I know enough Christian theologians that
you're saying, you did kind of say no, didn't you? You did say no.
I personally would switch teams.
Okay, if you didn't believe, if you thought the universe was causally closed, you'd have to find another spiritual tradition.
Yeah, and like I feel like my contemplative practice is tradition fluid.
What is your contemplative practice? I mean, is it prayer in a pretty conventional Christian sense? Is it meditation? Is it some of both, or what?
Well, I mean, over my life, it's shifted a lot, but like in the Christian, my first experience with it was in the centering prayer tradition out of Thomas Keating, which is a type of mindfulness practice that uses a single word as the way you reset. Like if you're sometimes you count back and forth, sometimes you're monitoring your breath, but you're attending to a particular word until you I don't usually tame things. I just observe how wild and crazy my brain is.
That's a start.
But before children, I was like much better at it. I anticipate when they go to college that or at least I'll get out of
I have some bad news for you.
My family has odd but consistent like patterns of cataphatic prayer where you use positive imagery and language at meals for gratitude, at the end of the day for introspection, and if somebody has hurt someone, that you seek reconciliation and to make amends, and if it's someone that's not in the family, that what you're going to do the next day. We pray for our enemies, and currently that mostly has to do with our president and those that continue to support him. I think the contemplative part's an important thing, but the descriptive part, when Jesus said, this is the thing about Christianity is, I find being in a community where you do the practices of Jesus to be liberating and life-giving regardless of your current answer to a God question. So as a minister, I would do confirmation groups for adults and 16 to 18-year-olds, and we would do what's called experiments in truth, and we would be doing Lectio Divina, which is a type of contemplative reading of Scripture, and through the gospel, whichever gospel was the one the church is reading that year. We have a cycle of readings every 3 years. And when Jesus told his disciples to do something, we'd pick whatever it was and then do it for a month. For example, I was working with high schoolers, end of high school, college, and they picked "Do Not Judge" as their first one. Because what adolescent doesn't like?
Judge not that ye be judged.
Yeah,
or judge not that ye not be judged. Whatever it is.
It depends on if King James is telling you what it is or not. But what we did was we had a text group, and everyone, if you judged someone, you texted the group, and everyone that received the text prayed for that person. God, you made and know and love this person completely. Help me learn to see them as you see them and treat them as you intend them to be treated. And you'd pray it for the person. Over a month, I think it was like week 3, someone finally texted their own name. And then there's a whole group of people that are praying for them who just judge themselves. And then others start voicing it. Because underneath the whole not judging for Christians is that the most true thing about you is that you belong and matter and are loved. And that's a gift from God, and you don't perform anything to get it. And yet we judge others mostly because we are judging ourselves. And so that at the end of a month where you actually have like 15, 18 to 22-year-olds who actually admit they self-judge all the time, and then it leads to toxic actions. Then you go like, well, does that experience make your life more human and give you more dignity? Yes. Well, Jesus invited people to follow him. And then, I think if you get around to believing something later, that's fine. But too many people will believe things about Jesus and then think God throws their enemies in hell for all eternity, which is just an odd thing. If you've actually prayed for your enemy for a month, you tend to have better theological responses.
Yeah.
So to me, those practices are why I find Christianity compelling. And then, as a person that did philosophy and religion PhD, then I can come up with all sorts of creative ways because I love the intersection of religion, science, philosophy, and stuff. But the the practices themselves give the purchase.
Yeah. So one great thing about this is it gives me a chance to plug the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which I put out every week with a team of mine. What triggered the thought of that? I mean, it's about, the premise is that, okay, if you're not enthusiastic about Trump, fine, I'm not, but don't assume that reacting viscerally to his every provocation is the most effective way to fight. This business of loving your enemy. So, there's a famous verse: if your enemy is hungry, give him food. If he's thirsty, give him drink. It's found both in the New Testament and in the book of Proverbs, in the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament. In fact, Paul in the New Testament is quoting it basically. What a lot of people don't know about that is that then it says, for by doing this, by treating your enemy nicely, you will heap burning coals on his head, or something like that. People differ about exactly what that means. It certainly suggests that somebody understood that sometimes there is actually tactical value in loving your enemy. As it's put actually later in that very same verse, I think it says, like, don't fight evil with evil. The most effective way to fight evil is to not exactly reciprocate it. And this is related to the don't judge thing, I think. So on the one hand, I think, I don't want to turn this into a highly political discussion at all, but let's just say there are politicians who, the more you hate them, the more you're playing their game. The more you're reinforcing their narrative and cementing their base to them, and so on. So there's a sheerly tactical thing, but then there's also, and that can mean there's tactical value in not judging, because if you judge the people who vote for them and say they're a bunch of racists or something or whatever, that too fits into this unnamed politician's narrative, right? And there's that. But then there's also the fact that aside from the tactical value of treating your enemies nicely and not judging, there's the profound wisdom in the sense of, kind of there, but for the grace of God, like, any of us born into their shoes might have, I might have, and moreover, just the fact that if you examine the circumstances of their life, maybe you can explain why they have the political views they hold, without resorting to some essentializing thing like, oh, they're just racist. Maybe the material circumstances of their life led them toward their views, just as the circumstances of your life led you toward your views. That's the end of my plug for the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which, by the way, you can subscribe to for free at mindfulresistance.net. But I love the newsletter. I regularly tweet it or tell people about it. So God bless you again.
Well,
that's two blessings you've earned in the course of only an hour. Now, so
we go for Trinitarian.
But there is, I don't know. Do you want to say anything about that? About anything more about the not judging thing? It's like so hard. I'm the worst at it by nature. I am the most like harshly judgmental person almost that I'm aware of by nature. It's like a constant struggle to just be like third worst instead of worst in the world at this.
Well, the thing that pops in my head is, so about a year ago, I moved back to North Carolina after 10 years in Los Angeles. We moved right after voting for Obama the first time in 2008, and North Carolina went blue. And over the last 10 years, the state went crazy. And, it coming back, like family members and friends that before would have just been, a conservative evangelical, now are like hardcore Trumpsters. They all bought guns, got paranoid, are saying all kinds of stuff that, like, in any sensible sense is racist in ways they would have never said stuff before. And then to move back and all your kids are California kids, that's where they grew up. They're like, what is this? And I initially had that angry reaction. And then I was driving with my son, picking up my daughter from preschool, and we come out of a church parking lot, church preschool, right in downtown Raleigh, in front of the giant Confederate statue in downtown Raleigh, which I grew up here with my grandpa, walked by, and there's one for all the wars. Of course, the Civil War is the biggest statue. And has these two cannons pointed out and a big statue, guy on top and everything. It says, "For our Confederate dead." And there is a class on a field trip walking in front of it that majority of them are not white. And my son, he's 10, starts crying. And I go, "What?" He goes, "Did you see that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, well, so that's the Revolutionary. That was Civil War one. You have the Vietnam one over here." And he goes, "Did you read it?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" "It says, 'For our Confederate dead.'" And there were school kids, like black school kids, walking in front of that statue. And it's right next to the church. Who lets that happen? And he's just hurt. Mm-hmm. And I say it because I was first back, all the anger of shock is there. And then I think, I walked by that statue for years with my grandfather when I was young. Mm-hmm. And when we walked by, he talked about Hiram Shaw Fuller, who was a delegate to the Confederacy from Arkansas and a sergeant in the family, and would tell our whole family story in relationship to the South and think nothing of it. Mm-hmm. And it's the same. And he was Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, was an advocate around racial inclusion and integration in the Air Force. When he retired, was Volunteer of the Year and was part of a lot of racial reconciliation work in the South. But like, your unexamined assumptions are just there. And it took my son to point out, like, you have things in you, right, that you don't know about, that linger. And so it was after that I found the Mindful Resistance newsletter, because I thought, it can't be good for me to just walk around throwing, holy fire at people and just steaming all day. I'm not a good dad, not a good husband that way.
Yeah, because for one thing, I think, sometimes, I mean, the more culturally threatened people feel, the more they don't want you to take anything away from them culturally. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I'm sure that for some of the people, these Confederate statues are, they hold on to them, for, racist reasons. But I also think that for some people, they're in a frame of mind where if you just say, we want to take this thing away too. And it's probably like you. They have people in their family and they just heard about their valor during the war. And maybe it wasn't a particularly racial thing. It's just part of it's part of the family. And, I'm just saying, don't jump to any particular judgment about why you get a particular reaction from people who are trying to hang on to the past until you've done a lot of investigative work. But, these days you can get in trouble for just saying what I said. Right? I mean, like on Twitter, if I said what I just said in a not super careful way, I'd get a tremendous pile-on from like my fellow progressives. It's like such a dicey environment. And
I think one of the consequences, and this is from talking with lots of ministers at very progressive churches, right? Where their denominations are progressive on most issues. So like saying something about it isn't a big deal. But I know a lot of ministers who would locate themselves very on the left side of things on most issues, who are just scared to talk about it because it might not be progressive enough and they don't want to get in trouble. Mm-hmm. Right. Which just seems pragmatically wrong. If you would like change to happen. I think the worst example, or it might just be, I think about it, is around environmental issues where, someone starts to realize that we have a serious problem. And the fact that they were on a plane twice in the last year, you've now like basically turned them into Satan. Yeah. And it's always funny from progressive religious people who don't even believe in Satan or hell. And they're like, no, I don't believe in hell literally. There's probably not a devil or anything.
But you are going there because you own an SUV.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think that there should be required evolutionary psych class at all the divinity schools.
I'm for that.
It would be an important part of pastoral care and counseling seminars. Otherwise, we give people language to raise the experiences of trauma and stuff like that without the tools to think about how you act with integrity and process that in your life.
So we've been going at this, I guess, at least an hour. We shouldn't go on a lot longer, but I want to get back to a little bit of the theology 101 character of this. As you mentioned earlier, I have an affiliation with Union Theological Seminary, New York, which is, of course, a very storied, historically significant institution. You've already mentioned two theologians who were there, Reinhold Niebuhr and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Who's interesting story. He's less well known, but he was, and his association with Union is less thoroughgoing. He had two different stints there, and at the very beginning of the second one, he was German. He decided that he should actually go back. This is the beginning of World War II, and be in the resistance. And ultimately, he was executed for being part of the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler in some sense. I mean, he had a kind of connection to it. So, and then the third, maybe you mentioned Tillich. Maybe you mentioned all three of these. But in any event, can you quickly tell us, maybe Tillich is the most relevant if you're talking about kind of super modern theology. But what relevance, what's the most important thing about Paul Tillich to you?
Well, so there are two things. One is his understanding of theology and its relationship to culture, right? So if you think of human beings, there's once the emergence of language, culture, rituals, and stuff start happening, there's this whole other sphere of shared human existence that has its own story and things. And he wants us to think theologically about culture. That culture is where the desires, questions, anxieties of an age, of a people, and things are processed. And theology for him involves, he calls it the method of correlation, in the sense that you can look at culture, the art, and start to see the anxieties of an age and the questions that they're wrestling with posed. And the job of a theologian is to start taking the questions that the prophetic tradition of faith puts to culture and the questions that culture is putting back to faith. And in that dialogue, you start to see what is it like to take yourself, your existence, your situation in history seriously and with a depth. And I think that the questions around theology and culture are really important. I love teaching it. In undergrad, I taught a class at Elon in January, Jan term class, where I didn't tell them we were doing Paul Tillich. They just read Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, and we use those as secular apocalypse narratives to talk about the anxieties of a world where neoliberal capitalism isn't working. We don't know our international structures that are going to help us think through ethics. We have an ecological collapse, and we might nuke ourselves at any moment, but we can't actually imagine a world without the structuring agents that we've inherited. And so we start to have these new cultural apocalypse narratives emerge up, and we can actually imagine what it's like to live post-apocalypse better than a world that's not determined in the current arrangement of neoliberal national order and stuff. And look at those cultural anxieties. So Tillich kind of sets up that conversation in a really helpful way. And the other thing he did is he directly took on, in the face of a lot of anti-intellectual evangelicalism in America, that the biblical God does not directly correspond to God as God is in God's self. He wrote a little cool book called Biblical Religion and the Search for Ultimate Reality. That's a fun way to get at it. But his whole point was, whatever we talk about when we talk about God is something you can't talk about directly. You have to get at it, and it happens to you. God is much more like a verb, an event, a being seized if you get at it experientially in an encounter. And so he talks about God as the unconditioned. And
the ground of being was another.
Yeah. And really what he means is finite things. They have beginnings and endings. They have context where they interact and things, and they could be the occasion for an event where the unconditioned kind of ruptures through, and you have this encounter with the depths. But you don't then point at the moment in history or the event the object it happens with and carry it around like you got an idol. and a lot of fundamentalism in wanting to preserve the experience in reality of God they've experienced in the life of the church, then turned the Bible into an idolatry, or the theology of the tradition into the actual objects God is housed in, as if God's first name was Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Tillich goes, no, you're missing the point. If you squeeze any part of conditioned existence as if that's holding God, you're going to squeeze God out of it. God shows up, but God's never yours. And that dynamism leads to a type of kind of apophatic philosophical framework where you understand that the religious tradition, its rituals, narratives, myths, and insights are helping cultivate your subjectivity in community such that you encounter the depths of existence, but it never tames and names it completely.
Okay. I have one more question, but before I ask it, I'm going to walk over and eliminate a noise that's emanating from my refrigerator. While I'm doing that, I will be able to hear you. I would just like you to quickly define apophatic, since you just used it.
Oh, yeah. So when you think about how language refers to God, apophatic is contrasted with cataphatic. Cataphatic are using positive statements about God, like God is love, God is ground of being, God is a parent, God is whatever. Apophatic is the unsaying of those things. And it's cultivated in medieval mysticism in some very strong ways. But the important thing about why is it pious to say, after someone says God is love, to say, but God is not, is because language is something that emerges in the life of human beings. It's a human creation. You can capture language, you can capture all these things and try to point at something ineffable. But if you ever associate what's been constructed ultimately as as the referent, then it's a problem. It's a problem thing. But see, I think we get that. Everyone, I think, gets it when you talk about your loved one. Like, my partner and I have known each other since we were 18. And I have an idea of her in my head, but she's not the idea in the construct I have. And anytime I essentialize her to be the idea or the object I have in my head, it's a problem for our actual relationship, because she's a genuine subject, a genuine mystery. And for some reason, people of faith, in an anxious age where there are new questions, different religions are interacting, people don't think God is necessary, all that kind of stuff, they think in order to preserve the reality of my encounter and experience with God, I have to absolutize the language or context of that encounter. And Tillich is wanting to go like, no, that's how you actually know you're not talking about God, is if you seize it. Ultimate reality is not held in a fist, because either you hand it to the next person and their hand grows to look like yours with your fingerprints, or they don't take it and you give it to them with a fist. And anything that can be called ultimate or the unconditioned or the source or one or whatever has to be related to with open hands. And the apophatic in saying your words aren't accurate is actually preserving the possibility that the one you're speaking about is a genuine, ultimate, mysterious subject. Okay.
I think that's a little Buddhist, but I won't get into that. I want to close, actually. Let's for now, let's say for another conversation, maybe Niebuhr and Bonhoeffer. I want to ask, bring us back from the theological to the more practical and inspirational. There's another figure who I think was associated with Union, but more famously was associated with Riverside Church, which is immediately adjacent to Union. You've probably been there physically, haven't you? Have you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Riverside Church, I'm thinking of Harry Emerson Fosdick. You're familiar with that name? It's a kind of an interesting story. I mean, as I understand it, the Rockefellers, these are Rockefeller's kids, I guess, or something. Anyway, it's after the Rockefeller money started supporting kind of liberal things. This is around the time of FDR, when Harry Emerson Fosdick was preaching. I think it may be that Riverside Church was built with Rockefeller money. Union predated that era, but had a kind of a symbiotic relationship with Riverside. And then also in that neighborhood, by the way, is the so-called God Box, a big building where that was also built with Rockefeller money, where like the National Council of Churches was, and all these nonprofits are now. And that's kind of relevant too, because as I understand it, I mean, Harry Emerson Fosdick was one reason he got their support was he was a person of liberal sensibility who became tremendously influential. So he had like a radio show, and his sermons were were put into books and so on. I mean, he's not super well known now, but at the time, like I think in the 30s, he was at least as influential as probably any famous evangelist you can name now. And but he was having the influence in, I think, a pretty highbrow realm, right? Like he was a cerebral guy. He was addressing well-educated people. And it was, and he had his political slant, and he had his spiritual backdrop. He was a Christian, but, and I'm just wondering, what is the closest thing you could find to that now? Because now when we think of Christians who have their political slant and have a huge platform, we think of conservatives. And we also think of people who are not, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but not dealing with a super well-educated audience. That's what we think of, and that's often the case. And I'm just kind of thinking, like, the Harry Emerson Fosdick niche, is it like empty? Is it being filled by anybody, or is it just like a fact that, okay, there's increasingly, among well-educated people, church affiliation is declining, and you're not going to see the fusion of the spiritual and political in this particular realm the way you used to, or it's not going to be Christian, it's going to be vague and New Agey, or maybe it's going to be Buddhist or what? Do you have any like thoughts relevant to that at all?
Well, I mean, the things that come immediately to mind are that the Henry Emerson Fosdick's audience,
I think it's Harry, but
or Harry Emerson Fosdick, is I mean, he's coming out of addressing the controversy between fundamentalist and modernist, and where American Protestantism, he was the voice for those siding with the project of modernity, in a sense.
Right. And he took issue with fundamentalism, and that got him, I think, kind of expelled from a certain part of his previous following, and then he was kind of adopted maybe by the Rockefellers. But anyway. So
and I just say that I don't think that's our controversy now. And in fact, mainline Protestants, when they were the dominant expression of American religion, they basically won, in the sense that what their big issues were around like equal rights and all that kind of stuff. They ended up passing all their legislation and when you theologically speak, mostly about
and
ethics.
We should say, maybe by mainline we mean like Episcopalian, the Christian denominations that did traditionally cater to the highly educated and more affluent. Yeah.
So that that in the mid 20th century, mainline religion, which is now not the dominant expression, was the steward of American power. It was the chaplain of American empire, and today I think progressives are problematize the tightness between that expression of faith and its connection to power. And I think our condition now is not between fundamentalist and modernist situation, where you have basically an assumed background of Christendom. In a post-Christendom context, when you're asking religious and spiritual questions, it's as people who are much more aware that we live in a cosmos that's big, growing, and expanding and such, much more aware of beautiful lives lived in multiple religious traditions, and much more aware that there are entirely kind of non-religious groups that still wrestle with the questions. Just think of how nerd culture has emerged and things like that. So the idea that there's going to be a central spiritual leader for the way our kind of collision of all these ancient traditions, I wouldn't be optimistic about it. I do think some people are going to try syncretistic hybrid type experiences. I know the data on growing is that people have multiple religious belonging But John Tatominal at Union has a new book he's working on about that, and that's, I think, pretty fascinating stuff. But if you're thinking of who played culturally the role that Fosdick plays, it's Oprah. That of the most influential spiritual teacher for the 1% is Oprah.
That's partly an answer, because that suggests we're talking about, I think, a kind of a new age spirituality in that case, at least, right?
Yeah, but but one that she can talk Christian if she wants to. She can she is spiritually fluid. And if you ever get a chance to talk to her, it's fascinating, because she has the force of personality in personal interactions that really good ministers do, right? Where you don't know what just happened, but someone just hugged your soul and they didn't even have to tell you that's what they were doing. But in Christian circles, I think someone like Rob Bell does that. Someone like Nadia Boltz-Weber is someone that does that. And the in Christian circles, the question or the predicament we have that makes Fosdick's kind of positive liberal statement of the gospel difficult is that the biggest growing area in Christendom are ex-evangelicals that have a lot of baggage. And if the issue's modernity for Fosdick, how do you articulate a life-giving encounter with God in the church, the call to social justice and transformation and things, and an affirmation of the scientific consensus? You can do that and invite people in. When you're dealing with individuals who experience trauma and pain and hurt from religious upbringings, it's hard to do it in a big, a big broad way. Some have anger and frustration because the church has been complicit in historic and systemic ills. Some because they've experienced judgment and been kicked out. Some are just embarrassed by propagating ignoramus ideas. So I think Christendom is in America has too many constituencies for someone to rise to the top, like someone like Fosdick, where the battle is fundamentalist rejection of modernity and yay modernity, because underneath Fosdick was the assumption that it's good for the church to form good citizens, to form good employees, and then form good family members. And the church had a role in helping form the civic order, the national order, the economic order. Today, a lot of those legacies are getting questioned because new voices and experiences are being raised. And when bigger questions are put on the table, it's hard to speak in monologue about it.
Okay, so Tripp, this has really been fun. If we had more time, if I didn't have other things scheduled in like 15 minutes, I'd keep it going, even though it would be setting just about a record for us for length.
We're gonna talk tomorrow.
As it happens, we're gonna talk on your platform tomorrow, or at least record on your platform tomorrow, right?
Yeah, and the only thing I would say is I did make a movie. So if you're, if you're still listening, you would probably like the movie. It's called The Road to Edmond. It's a buddy road trip comedy about a youth minister that gets fired for being open and affirming to LGBTQ people, and but it has a sense of humor like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Edmond?
Edmond, like Edmond, Oklahoma.
Okay, I was born in Oklahoma, by the way.
Well, then this is right.
It's right up my alley. I wasn't born in Edmond, but and you tweet at, is it just your name, TRIPPFULLER at Twitter?
Yep.
Okay, and I'm Robert Writer, WRIGHTER.
My
on Twitter.
website's trippfuller.com, and the movies is theroadedmond.com.
And again, the podcast is Homebrewed Christianity at a podcast app near you.
Yeah. And I have 7 books. If you just go to Amazon and type my name in, I wrote and then edited a series called Homebrewed Christianity Guides. And, I wrote a book. I wrote the Guide to Jesus, but it's like on historical criticism and the history of Christology. There's one to God, to evil, and all sorts of topics. But
It's hard to imagine anybody having any questions left after they read all your books.
I know. That's why they could just buy multiple copies.
Yeah. Or leave one unread just so that your life won't be devoid of inquiry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Tripp. This was great.
Awesome.